Do all shamanic paths carry the same purpose, power, and protection? In this episode, I'm joined by two remarkable guests, Isaac Wortley and Eddy Elsey. Isaac and Eddy are both apprentices of a traditional Mongolian shamanic lineage, founded by their teacher at Mother Tree Shamanism. Isaac is an English shaman who experienced a calling from a very young age. That call led him to seek out an authentic teacher of Mongolian shamanism, and over 10 years ago, he was initiated by his teacher and has been a practicing apprentice ever since. Whereas Eddy, like so many of us in the West, came from a neo-shamanic background. But after becoming seriously unwell, he found his way to the traditional Mongolian lineage and has been apprenticing for the past 3 years. Together, we explore the healing depth and rigor of traditional shamanism, especially within the Mongolian lineage that all three of us now follow. Isaac shares the incredible story of being drawn to Mongolia from the age of 10 without knowing why, and how stepping onto the path he was truly called to instantly shifted years of illness and struggle. Eddy talks about how years of neo-shamanic practice left him feeling broken and ill, and how the traditional path became the turning point in his healing and transformation. We explore the distinctions between traditional core and neo-shamanism, and why those differences might really matter. So much can get lost when the West tries to recreate ancient systems, and sometimes what's lost is exactly what makes the path work. We also look at what truly makes a lineage powerful: its scientific nature, the role of rigorous mind training, the depth of karmic connection with a teacher, and the understanding that perhaps this isn't something that can be covered in a few weekend workshops. It's a path that spans lifetimes. This is a conversation about remembering what's real and how easy it is to forget, and what becomes possible when we finally return. And before we jump into all of that good stuff, if you're struggling with the challenges of walking your soul path in this crazy modern world and would benefit from guidance, kinship, and support, come join our Academy of the Soul, Unio. You can find out more by hopping on over to bemythical.com/Unio or click the link in the description. And now back to this week's episode. Let's dive in. Hello, Isaac. Hello, Eddy. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us. Hi, it's really nice to be here. Thanks.
Oh, my pleasure entirely. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I often like to begin episodes with a little bit of a origin story. And I know you both have got really interesting. I'm lucky enough to already have a bit of a sense as to what has brought you both to your practice, your path today. So I'd love to just begin with sharing a little bit of that with listeners. And Isaac, you've got, I'd say, I don't think I've come across someone from the West with your story. There is something, just so unique in what brought you to where you are today. So would you just share a little bit? I know, as ever, it's kind of like, what do I leave out? How do I squeeze all of that into one? But as much as you think would be helpful for listeners to understand about you.
So as you mentioned, yeah, it's a long story, but basically I was called to shamanism from a young age. A very young age, I felt this pull to Mongolia. And as the years progressed, basically my health declined and declined. And the pull only grew stronger. I first went Mongolia when I was 16 years old, and I found my teacher when I was 21. Just turned 21. When I found her, I found them. I didn't even realize they were a shamanic practitioner. I have to speak to this person.
Mm.
And then obviously my health problems got diagnosed. The cause of it was a shamanic calling. And the moment that I was accepted as a student and began practicing and learning and doing the things, all my health problems that had plagued me for years went away. And it was something that I never thought would have happened. Like, all the health problems went away, even the smallest ones. And every part of my life, my family's life, and everyone around, like close to me, everything just improved.
Mm. Would you mind sharing a little bit about the kind of health problems that you'd experienced?
Yes, so there was a lot of physical ailments. There would be various attacks. There was even non-epileptic seizures and other things. But there'd be like attacks where it would come over where I'd be unable to walk. Most people, when they think of shamanic sickness in the West, they have a tendency of thinking it's like a psychological problem, like a mental health issue. But traditionally, the traditional view on shamanic sickness is it's more physical ailments. Obviously, psychological issues go along with it, but shamans are the most balanced people. They maintain the balance within themselves as well. So it's not the wounded healer paradigm that most people think of. It's more physical ailments, physical signs and symptoms. And just because you have physical signs and symptoms doesn't mean that you're meant to be a shaman. Same with psychological symptoms. That has to be checked out to be verified by, in traditional cultures, it'd be an elder that would verify that.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's many causes of problems that could mimic it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that really makes sense. And what's your sense now as to why those health conditions all, seemingly miraculously were alleviated when you were accepted onto the path?
Um, so correct me if I'm wrong. Your question is asking me why did they go away?
Yes.
Because it was a pull towards the practice. So when I started practicing it, the pull disappeared because I
I
was
see.
doing what I was meant to do.
Yeah. And what's your understanding of why? Again, it's an unusual. There's plenty of people that would say I felt a call to shamanism, or even a call to a particular lineage or part of the world. But I think what's unusual about your story is it began so young, and you also prioritized it in a way that I think again is really rare. It isn't like you had, like say for example, in my case, I I spent years in the corporate world in a very kind of, mainstream life. You,
Mm.
as far as I understand, just didn't have that at all. You kind of had such a strong sense of this is where I need to go. What's your understanding as to why that is?
Um, I guess you could say karma, and not only that, it would be. I just had this sense from such a young age. Honestly, I can't even explain it myself. The only way I can explain it is karma.
Mm,
From such a young age, from the age of 10, I knew I had to go to that part of the world.
mm.
There was no doubt in my mind. It was the only driving factor. It was the force that drove me. Obviously, yes, I have worked in, you could say, more corporate jobs in the time being, because obviously shamanism is a duty, not
I have to question the word corporate when it comes to you. I kind of
not corporate, but more so. But I've definitely been involved in like various businesses, teaching positions, and other things as
Mhm.
um, because shamanism is a duty, not just a career.
Mm.
So, like most shamans are traditionally, obviously, were herders. They were herders in addition to their shamanic duties.
Mm.
So they did the same as everyone else, and then they had more to do on top.
Yeah, it wasn't a glamorous like, oh yay, I get to be the shaman.
No, if
Mhm.
anything, a lot of people try to reject their calling when they come when they find out.
Mm. That makes sense. There's I suspect we will get a bit more into this as the episode goes on, but as you mentioned karma there's something that has surprised me actually, is that I guess sort of weaving of Buddhism with Mongolian shamanism that I think we'll go a bit deeper into later in the show. But I'm saying it now partly because I think words like karma have been a bit kind of appropriated kind of like by our just sort of mainstream use of them, if that makes sense. Where I know that when you say it, you actually mean it in its real sense, like with a understanding of what that means. And so in case we don't get further into that, I just want to make that point now. You're not just sort of saying it as a throwaway comment, which it might have sounded like is how you meant it.
Oh no, it's the law of cause and effect.
Mm-hmm.
So every action that we do has a reaction in this life or previous lives. So obviously, from our previous lives, we carry imprints over into this life. When you talk about the blending of the Buddhism and the shamanism, a lot of that comes from the fact that, especially when people talk about Tibetan Buddhism, before Buddhism came to there, it was had a pre-existing shamanic culture. So as Buddhism came to those countries like Mongolia, Tibet, the shamanic traditions were blended and absorbed within Buddhism. So a lot of these concepts of even some of the spirits' names and some of the things like that, some of the rituals, they are actually pre-Buddhist shamanic rituals that have just been absorbed over time into the practice.
Mm.
So there are a lot of similarities between the two. Both of them have their own place. So both of them are trying to alleviate suffering for an individual. Buddhism, the goal is enlightenment. With shamanism, the goal is bringing balance.
Yeah. And it's something that I've certainly very much appreciated about traditional Mongolian shamanism. And I definitely would like to get a bit further into that. But for the moment, I'd love to hear a bit more about your story, Eddie. And again, different to Isaac's, but really fascinating. And so I'd love to hear, I guess, what first called you to shamanism as a whole, which, like me, was more what we might call in fact, I'd love to go a bit deeper into this kind of like the terminology, neo-shamanism, core shamanism. But for the moment, what called you initially into that as a path, and then kind of like how you've ended up finding yourself on a traditional path?
Well, unlike Isaac, up to the age I was about 22 or 23, I couldn't have been less interested in spirituality. It just didn't cross my radar. My family wasn't religious, so I didn't really even experience religion. I spent most of my late teens and early 20s trying to find myself in other ways. I did a lot of partying and used to put on raves with my friends and
That
spent a
age-old
lot
way
of
of trying to
time.
find yourself.
Spent a lot of time at the football, and that led me to some very difficult mental health issues. I had really intense anxiety. I suffered a lot from OCD. I bounced around therapy for a while and eventually decided to go to a yoga class. It didn't really help me that much. I ended up training as a yoga teacher, but it just wasn't my path really. And then like a lot of people in the West, I got introduced to practices like Reiki, and eventually through sort of experiencing different ceremonies and different kind of things that were on offer in London, which is where I'm from, I found Neo-shamanism, which I didn't really know it was Neo-shamanism at the time, but I went to a few kind of core practitioner training days, and I felt a pull towards that. I felt a pull towards shamanism and became very interested in it and trained in neo-shamanism for 3 years. And it taught me a lot. It taught me a lot about, the dedication needed, and taught me a lot about patience and diligence, and taught me, somewhat a lot about myself, and opened me up to a really beautiful community, and spending a lot of time in nature as a guy from London. That's not something I really did growing up. And so that part of it was very, very beneficial. And after I trained, when I took it out into the world and started seeing people for healings and clients and, really, really practicing in a hardcore way, the way I'd been taught, I started to become very sick, sicker than I'd ever been. And I had, like I said, pre-existing anxieties and OCDs, but they went from maybe a 3 out of 10 to like an 8 out of 10. Started to get really intense physical symptoms and inflammation and heart palpitations. And I started to become very worried because no one in the neo-shamanic community could properly diagnose me. I went for brain scans, blood tests, x-rays as well, and no one in the Western medical community could diagnose me. And I was, really, really sick and bedridden, really. And my wife started to get very sick as well. And generally our lives just started to fall apart, health-wise, finance-wise. Everything just seemed very, very dark. And I had a pull then, to go to Mongolia. I was 30, and I was put in touch with the woman who was Isaac's teacher, but I didn't know that at the time. I'd never met Isaac, and would later become my teacher. And similarly to Isaac, I didn't know she was a practitioner. I was put in touch with her from someone who in the shamanic scene in the West, who I respect very, very, very much so. So I knew that whoever it was going to be a very legitimate source of shamanism. And within 3 days of being in Mongolia, I'd been diagnosed and treated ritually within a week, and then given a treatment plan. Within a year, I had basically recovered. Within another year after that, it was better than ever, and have been training now for 3 years in traditional shamanism, traditional Mongolian shamanism. And so it was, a very different journey than Isaac's. But yeah, that was it really.
Fascinating. Do you mind sharing a little bit about, because I suspect people listening are going to be like, oh my goodness, so you're not just talking about you had a little bit wrong with you, as you described, you were having all kinds of diagnostic treatments, trying to understand what sounds like very severe health conditions, and then seemingly in one ritual, and of course, whatever it is you were asked to do in the year following, it went away. Was that the same reason as Isaac shared, that you were kind of called to shamanism and it all alleviated because you'd found your path, or was this something different? I'd love to know a bit more about that.
It was something different. My issues were self-inflicted. I made myself sick by my previous practice, essentially. Part of the reason was doing too much too soon. Part of the reason was that the practices I learned were inadequate for doing the work that I was doing and working with people. A part of it was my own karma and my own destiny. Part of it was my own, mind, my own greed and my own misunderstanding of how the world works and of myself. So there were many different factors, and not one person is to blame. I'm as much to blame, than anyone. So I'm not, attacking neo-shamanism or, anything like that, but this is just my personal experience. So there were many, many factors. I think what was outlined to me in Mongolia is they understood all of those factors and how they were intertwined. That was what was different. Western medicine told me, from a Western medical perspective, okay, there's issues with your heart. You've got really intense anxiety, but there was no solution. Western shamanic practitioners could see that there was something wrong with me and let's say a dark energy, but they couldn't diagnose what it was, and they couldn't get rid of it. So there are lots of different pieces of the puzzle in the West, and it's only when I went to Mongolia that they had the traditional knowledge to very quickly put all of those pieces together and give me a clear picture of what was happening. And not only could they do that, they could give me a solution to how I would get my life back. And everything happened exactly the way that they said it would.
Wow. And was there, although it took time for you to fully recover, was there an immediate shift after that ritual in that first week you were there?
Yeah. After the first ritual, the main problem went away. I suffered from very horrendous intrusive thoughts, and they just basically disappeared. Then the rest of it was, putting myself back together. If we have a splinter and the splinter gets infected, when you take out the splinter, the infection still remains. And so, metaphorically, the splinter had been removed, but my mind were infected.
That's a good analogy.
And that takes time for everyone. But things got better and better and better and better. It wasn't just one day everything disappeared. My life went from strength to strength to strength to strength, and everything started building back. Which doesn't mean it was easy. On my end, it took a lot of practice and faith, but that's a tiny, tiny price to pay for the recovery.
Yeah. And I know that you were, if I don't mean this insultingly, I think many of us can have shared these kind of experiences. I think you went from being quite almost like a bit of an evangelist for shamanism, sort of, back then. And as you say, were kind of out and practicing and talking about it. And then from my understanding is you've taken quite a sort of backseat and a break from that, and kind of only just more recently started to kind of emerge back into practicing as you are. Is that accurate?
Yeah, very accurate. Before I went to Mongolia, I really thought I knew what I was talking about. I really thought I was, I'd done my training. I knew what I needed to know. I really knew what shamanism was. But when I got to Mongolia, all of that shattered. And I didn't realize before I went to Mongolia that the reason I was sick was because there was an issue with my personal practice. I didn't think those two things were linked. I actually thought that was the only thing that, was kind of keeping a little shred of positivity in my life. So that was a shock to me. And it was very, very humbling. And it was difficult to navigate in a way, because a lot of my kind of ego and self-worth were attached to my previous practice. And I let everything go and took a back seat and became an estate agent and just concentrated on my healing. And
I love the just complete juxtaposition of shamanism and being an estate agent. I love that.
Yeah, well, I needed, like Isaac said, shamanism is a duty and it's not a job. And I definitely conflated those two, and it was my main source of income. And I, gave that up. And it wasn't difficult in that sense to give it up because, like I said, my life got better and better. So,
but it required something, didn't it? You ensure your whole identity shifted, and you had to rebuild a life, career, and everything. So, yeah,
yes, I did.
Quite an undertaking.
But it was only for my benefit, It's something that I had to do, and I'm hugely grateful for the guidance that allowed me to do that. And now, 3 years later, everything is back to normal, and everything is positive again. So it's it was quite a journey, but in the scheme of things, really didn't take that long. Like I said, things were kind of put back in place within 2 years, and that's remarkable, really.
Yeah, it really is. So we've touched so far on, I guess, a few different forms of shamanism. During this conversation, we've mentioned traditional shamanism, core shamanism, neo-shamanism, and it feels as though before we go further, it might be helpful just to make a few distinctions as to what is meant by them. I mean, certainly with, say, neo and core, they can be kind of lumped together and sometimes are called core as a group. And so I'd love to start with you, Isaac. Obviously, your sole experience has been with traditional, but I would just love your sense as to kind of what's meant by those different forms.
So traditional shamanism is any shamanism from a culture that's practiced shamanism for thousands of years, unbroken. When it comes to core and neo-shamanism, core shamanism specifically is associated with Michael Hana, and neo-shamanism is anything that kind of branches out after that, it seems. Obviously, I've got no personal experience learning from core or neo-shamanism, and I've only ever trained with my teacher. When it comes to, I would say the big difference is also the core shamanism, from my understanding, at least they tried to strip out a lot of the cultural elements. I'm not personally 100% on that. Maybe Eddie could shed some light, because obviously Eddie has much more experience with both core and neo-shamanism.
Yeah, I mean, again, core shamanism and neo-shamanism, different things. Like Isaac said, core shamanism is associated with Michael Hana, and I have never experienced that. And when I've spoken about this in the past, people are thankful that I make that distinction, because when I detail, the way that my training went, they say it's very different, and there seems to be a lot of differences within core shamanism. I believe that the FSS have a certain way of doing things, and could potentially even be called the very, very early stages of a lineage. I think they've been going since the 80s, and they have their own formula and their own way that things work, but I haven't experienced it, so I can't talk to that. Neo-shamanism, is inspired, I think, by that, and I would call neo-shamanism anything that has a focus on shamanic journeying. What is known in neo-shamanic circles as soul retrieval, ancestral healing. These are generally the kind of things that you would learn, and these practices are inspired by practices that are from traditional cultures. Like Isaac said, they lack the traditional context, and they perhaps can be effective, for some people, in some ways, can have some benefits, but they're certainly not the same as they are in lineage-based spirituality. But they, it's not really a comparison. Like Isaac said, traditional spirituality has been practiced for thousands of years. Core and neo-shamanism has been practiced since the 80s. So it's actually unfair to compare them. I don't necessarily think that should be done. I think what is beneficial, and would have been very beneficial for me in my early 20s, is if there was more education around the differences and also the limitations of neo-shamanism. Had I known that, I think I would have made a more informed decision.
Well, I think what you're saying there, I mean, in some ways, talking about the differences is making a comparison. And I know that's not your intention, but I also agree, there is, I think, again, coming from a similar path to you where it wasn't core, it was neo. I don't think it's like I don't know if others in similar kinds of teachings would share this same experience I'm about to name, but it's like I was very aware that there were traditional lineages, but I suppose there isn't necessarily the awareness that there is a real need if one is going to practice to learn in that kind of lineage, but it's also you don't necessarily know there's an availability to do that. It's not something that's obviously available as a path. And so I think these kind of conversations are helpful. It's not for everyone, but I do think there is something in being able to have these kind of conversations that allows that to be a choice that someone could make.
So one thing I would like to add here is when it comes to obviously the traditional shamanism and versus core shamanism, or versus neo-shamanism argument that you hear a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
As Eddie said, it's really unfair to compare the two, because neo-shamanism and core shamanism are new practices. They don't have the trial and error of thousands of generations and years to show like the safety mechanisms. Obviously, it works perfectly fine for some people, and other people fall through the loopholes. I think it's potentially more FSS have their own kind of formula, whereas when it comes to neo-shamanism, I'm not sure about their formula. From what I've heard, it seems to vary very drastically across the board. But a lot of the practices obviously are based upon traditional cultures, but they're more animistic in nature.
Mm.
And animism is like the foundation and the core of shamanism. But shamanism is evolved to a scientific level.
Mm.
There's many different aspects of science to it, including a traditional medical system, which seems to be lacking in these newer practices that are forming in the West. So you're only getting, almost as Eddie said, like one piece of the puzzle.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, certainly, I think what you've named, there was a couple of things actually that similar things were crossing my mind at the same time. So just speaking personally, that having even it's not the nicest word, but like a sort of framework for an animistic practice, I think can be really beneficial. It's, how humans lived and saw the world and moved through the world for most of human history. So I think there is a huge benefit that can come from that kind of reclaiming that animistic worldview and way of living. Certainly that's something I know I've benefited from hugely. And I also know, just from my much more recent experience of a traditional lineage compared to you two, there is this kind of scientific, like a true science aspect. And again, it's not like I'm familiar with lots of different traditional lineages, but certainly as far as the Mongolian tradition, it is so complex. It is based on principles and laws and things that I just feel like I'm scratching the surface of, and I'm already like, whoa, there is so much here. And so I'd love to pick up that thread of like what are we actually talking about. I don't necessarily mean sort of go into the details, but I think that's the bit I had no idea of. And we're
So
talking about the fact that these things are so different. I had no idea the level of complexity that would be involved in a traditional lineage. It has blown my mind. In fact, I'm going to speak to you, Eddie, first, because Isaac, you've not known anything different. Eddie, what was your sense of that? Did you find it as mind-blowing as I did?
I found it very overwhelming, actually. True shamanism, or traditional shamanism, is the science of the universe. It's been developed in Mongolia, which is the tradition we've been trained into, a profound level, and it's incredibly complex. And it allows those who practice to restore balance in their environment and cope with and cooperate with the world around them, which is a very complex, very difficult thing to learn. It's not something that can be learned in 3 days or 3 years. It's a lifelong practice. And it also, like Isaac touched upon, involves a good understanding in not just ritual practice, but an understanding in astrology, in medicine, also a good understanding of psychology, and to understand how to work with people and to be a leader and to be able to be of service to your community, and a deep understanding of your own mind, which is incredibly complex as well. So if you put these things together, you can see how it has taken thousands of years to develop, and also how it would be impossible for a practice that developed out of the 80s, even if it has been inspired by traditional practice, to have the same complexity. And if it doesn't have the same complexity, then it cannot be as effective. And with neo-shamanism, I think that people focus on the sort of visionary states and journeying and finding messages, and there isn't enough emphasis on the mind. There isn't enough emphasis on the way that the world actually works, and it's because of that that there can be some loopholes and gaps, which is where people end up tripping themselves up, which is where I ended up tripping myself up, and I didn't see that it was my practice that was doing that. That's how blind I was personally. So when I went to Mongolia, thinking, oh yeah, I know my stuff, I really I didn't know anything.
Yeah. And Isaac, from a kind of more of an insider's perspective, how would you talk about this sense of there is sort of scientific laws that underpin Mongolian? Again, I don't think we can perhaps broaden it out to kind of traditional shamanism as a whole. Let's, I guess, stay focused on what we do know. When it comes to Mongolian shamanism, why do you call this scientific?
So I may broaden it out a little as well. I have encountered Nepalese shamans and Korean shamans, and they all have this same underpinning philosophy of how the world works. It's literally the science of the universe and how it functions, universal law. So a lot of people would ask, why are you engaging in a practice that's not from your region or not from your culture? Which I think a lot of people trying to reclaim their animistic heritage, they have a look at paganism or they have a look at these other practices. But the fact is, as Eddie mentioned, it's been developed to a profound level where they understand how the universe works. Whether you perform the ritual in Mongolia, whether you perform it in England, whether you perform it in the Americas, it will respond the same. It doesn't matter where you are. And it's the science of so many different factors. As I mentioned, one of them is medicine. So it's understanding how the body works on a holistic level. So not just, someone might take a paracetamol when they've got a headache. But if they keep getting reoccurring headaches, why are they getting the reoccurring headaches, and can it be treated via the herbs? Or is there spiritual treatment that needs to be done? So it's not just looking at the body in one way. It's looking at the complete system of the body, the complete system of the universe, and the culture and the community. And the practice doesn't only affect the individual, it affects the community around them, bringing balance to the natural world, bringing balance in the community, and also to the family as well. There's so many different aspects, and it's so many layers.
Yeah.
And you mentioned about practice. Not a lot of people don't realize these practices are now available for Westerners to learn, or people in the West to learn. But over recent years, there's Mother Tree Shamanism, and then there's Bola Banstala, which is Nepalese shamanism. They've begun openly teaching because they want to share what they have to help the people that are struggling.
You answered the question I was about to ask you, which is why are they? Why are these traditional teachers sharing? Because I think we can, and it often, I guess, is the case. There can be a kind of guarding of the knowledge and the lineage, and I'm guessing in certain cases that is the appropriate thing. And perhaps talk directly to Mother Tree Shamanism. Why, and perhaps if you just share a little bit more, why is this being shared more widely?
So basically, it's being shared more widely because there has been so many people that have been struggling, both physically, mentally, health-wise, spiritually, and it's been seen by traditional shamans, and they want to do their best to help the younger generation and guide them in the correct way, leading them to a path where they can safely practice and not only bettering their own lives, but bettering their families, their relationships, their communities, and even the natural world around them, and understanding the underpinnings of the universe and the world around them. and also to be able to diagnose problems effectively. So not everyone's going to go away and become a shaman. But even if they practice as a shamanist and have someone that they can reach out or be pointed in the right direction, to go to a traditional doctor, go to this person for this, then at the very least, then they will also have their own personal first aid that they can treat themselves and their loved ones with. And if it's a serious problem that they feel unable to cope with, then they can go to the person that will help.
Thank you. I'm very, very aware that there's so much that we could go deeper into, and I feel like I'm kind of like skipping us along quite fast, but I do want to make sure there's certain things that we have had a chance to talk about. And one of the ones that, again, for me has been quite striking is what's seen as that teacher-student relationship and its place in traditional shamanism, which in some ways is, one of those things where you have the worldview you've been raised in or been taught in, so you think you know. And then you start to realize, like, oh, I actually didn't know what was meant or why this was needed. And so this is something I think that anyone that's called to shamanic practice would really benefit from hearing what's really meant and why it's important to have this teacher-student bond. I'm going to come to you first, Eddie, because of course you like me have had a kind of a blend of experiences, and then I'd certainly like to hear your sense too, Isaac.
I think in the West, and speaking generally, and I hope I don't offend anyone with this, that often we pay for a course and we have a relationship with our teacher through that transaction, and we learn. And that's not to say that that relationship can't be close, but it's one of there's a superficial nature to it. We're often not a huge part of that person's life, and they're not a huge part of our life. Whether that's for 3 days, 3 years, whether you become friendly with your teacher or not, and see them outside of that sort of realm of your neo-shamanic training, maybe, but there's a superficial nature to it. My experience with the student-teacher bond in traditional culture, and certainly with our teacher, is that it's far, far deeper than that. It's family, maybe perhaps deeper than family. It's something that is not just for one lifetime, it's for multiple lifetimes, and there's a deep care that's mutual. It's not just your teacher with you and looking after you, or it's not just a student looking after the teacher. There's a mutual care and relationship that extends, and you really deeply care about them, how they are, their future, their family, and that goes on for life. And it's a very serious thing to have a traditional teacher, and for a traditional teacher to take on a student. It's not something that's done lightly, and there's certainly a karmic bond. And it honestly took me a while to get my head around it. It really did. I came to this with a lot of blind spots around my own selfishness, and my own lack of willingness to really give myself up and sacrifice the practice. And that has consistently been illuminated. And, I'm at the stage where I'm starting to understand now, just what is needed and why that is important. It's important because you need a deeper transmission to really understand spirituality. And that transmission doesn't just happen through a screen if you're learning online, or words and, okay, do this ritual, or learn this technique. It really comes through the care and affection and a real bond of you and your teacher, soul to soul and mind to mind.
Yeah, and it's something that so few of us have experienced. To be honest, even if it's not even not just talking about shamanism, but kind of many forms of spirituality, I think we have this very kind of pick and mix approach to spirituality in the West, and do just think we can kind of move from teacher to teacher, course to course, lineage to lineage, and we don't know any differently. I think there is a kind of is a worldview. It's such a shift. I feel like I'm only just sort of getting a glimpse of really what's being spoken about. But even what I've seen, I have got this real deep appreciation of like, wow, we're so missing that. Isaac, I know that certainly what we're talking about, you've got deep experience of, and as Eddie was saying, more like family. I was smiling because I know you've shared stories with me of, like really what's meant by that. And, the ways that can, very much be like a kind of mother-son relationship, for example. But I'd love to hear your sense of this.
It really is like the true teacher-student bond really is like family. It's not just with spiritual practice. The teacher is also helping to guide the student in their life to make sure they have the best life possible, every aspect. They're trying to benefit them. In the West, we obviously have a lot of, maybe not just in the West, I think people in modern day society, there's a sense of separation and disconnect from one another. So when it comes to letting yourself be open with a teacher on that level, a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, they're going to take advantage of me, and a lot of fear. And obviously there are people
there
out
are
there
unscrupulous teachers out there too. Yeah.
So it's up to the student and the teacher to accept the student, because the student might be unscrupulous, and then the student to accept the teacher. But once that's happened, there has to be traditionally there'd be a really close bond. And in Asia, once they make the mind to accept a teacher, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's shamanism, they know they're getting into a minimum of literally quite a few lifetimes worth of teacher-student bond. And the teacher's thinking about the student's lifetime in this lifetime, the lifetime in the next, and also with their practice, making sure they're safe. They care about the student as they'd care about their own child and family.
Yeah.
So it's obviously, I think that is missing in the West. And as both of you were saying, there's a term I heard mentioned, spiritual materialism, where the people they move on from one thing to another, and they treat it like a commodity, but without committing to anything. Yeah. And obviously, not everyone in the West does that, but some people, I think it's probably the same anywhere.
And innocently done. I think, when we have a sense that we're lacking something, it's kind of an obvious, a bit like you were sharing with your story, Eddie, where you kind of, yoga, then Reiki, then this, then that. It's coming from, often good intentions, just wanting to feel better. And if we don't know there is an alternative, we're just doing our best. So it's not even, certainly my intention isn't to kind of shame people, make that wrong. We're doing the best we can. And these are things we just don't know because we haven't seen modeled and haven't seen experienced. But I've certainly, just in conversations with you, Isaac, when you shared that relationship and kind of the form it takes, I'm always so moved, like, wow, this really is a whole different dynamic to what we think is meant by student teacher. It really, again, it amuses me sometimes, but it really is moving as well.
Yeah, and the spiritual materialism is not me mentioning that term, is not to shame anyone for doing it, because a lot of people will be hunting for something to make them feel complete or whole, or to make them feel better if they're struggling. And if it doesn't serve them, then of course they'll look elsewhere. With the teacher-student bond as well, it literally, I don't think we even have the concept for it in the West, because as I mentioned, people are becoming more distant even from their own families. So obviously, shamanism is an ancestral practice of honoring your ancestors. But most people, not most people, but a lot of people don't even honor their own parents. So how can they
Yeah.
hope to practice something of honoring ancestors?
Mm.
Your parents are your ancestors. Just you can't even honor the living ones. So what? How can you honor the ones that have passed away?
Yeah, for sure. I'm really aware that there's just, we really have just scratched the surface, and we're almost up on time. We may well need to come back and do a part 2 if you two are up for it. But one thing I'd love to make sure we've at least touched on before we close is one of the things that really struck me, having had some experience now of a Mongolian traditional path, is this, how can I name this, looking, rather than being just focused on, say, shamanic practice and learning shamanic rituals, a much deeper understanding of kind of the person themselves and their understanding of their own mind. And I feel often quite fortunate because before I got involved in shamanism, I've been on a kind of a spiritual path much longer than that. Mine's not Buddhism, it's the Kabbalah primarily. But so many of the same kinds of concepts and same understanding of the mind is something I've been used to for so many years, which I think equipped me to deal with that not being included in, say, neo-shamanism much better. It's like I came from a place that was already quite balanced, and having done a lot of that kind of work already, whether it's meditation, all these things where I feel as though they are kind of essential for anyone that's then acting as a practitioner, helping other people. However, that's just not something that's understood and practiced very much, from my understanding at least, in, say, neo-shamanism. And so when I began with Mongolian shamanism, I was like, wow, this is interesting. It's not just included, it's prioritized, it's essential. And so I had a real appreciation for that. It surprised me, but I had such a deep appreciation for that. So coming to you first, Eddie, what's been your experience of that? Because again, I think this is something that isn't known and isn't spoken about much outside of these places where it's kind of, again, intrinsically baked into it.
I didn't think that I didn't think shamanism included any training of the mind before I went to Mongolia, and it was a big shock to me. I didn't learn previously any mind control practices or any practices that helped me really understand the mind on a deep level. Shamanism has an understanding of the mind to a very, very scientific level. It's not just kind of superficial. It breaks down the science of the mind, where the mind exists, how to work with the mind, and everything to do with it. We won't get into here, but if you don't have an understanding of your true self, how do you hope to either help people or work with other forces? Everyone knows within shamanism, there's the ritual element, and there's an aspect of working with ancestors or spirits. It's just impossible to do so without a foundation of understanding in your own mind and to understand who you are. And again, I think that's where I tripped myself up so much with neo-shamanism, was because I had absolutely no control of my mind, completely.
Which is average people, isn't it? Like that's the norm for most people, shamans or not.
Yes, because the mind has to be trained. The mind is unruly, and we lack a real understanding of it. And I'm not just talking about in spiritual communities in the West. I think the West in general has a real lack of understanding of the mind. And I think that's also why we see so much unhappiness, uneasiness,
Yes.
loneliness, suffering, mental health issues, which is a real epidemic. Practices like Mongolian shamanism, like Buddhism, have developed like I said, an understanding of the mind to a profound level. And this is another reason why it's so important that people, if they're interested, start understanding these practices and start learning from these authentic sources, because there's a lot that can be avoided, a lot of suffering that can be understood and avoided, and I think that's very important for people to understand in the West.
Yeah. Isaac, anything you'd like to add on that before we close?
So, when it comes to understanding the mind, I would say it's such a major aspect, as both of you have mentioned, in traditional shamanism. When I was first started learning, my teacher said this to me. She said, it doesn't take one ritual to make a shaman, but it does take one ritual to make a deluded one. Because if you don't know your own nature and you don't know your own mind, how can you differentiate between your own mental projections and what the spirits are telling you? How can you differentiate between the two? So when it comes to, at least from my understanding from speaking to others, a lot of these practices that are growing in the West, they don't have this concept of the mind being such an important factor. Whereas in traditional shamanism, Mongolian shamanism, they learn about the mind, they learn how to control it, they learn its very nature, the processes it goes through. Like they have to learn every single aspect of that to be a good practitioner. As I mentioned earlier, the most balanced, stable individuals are the shamans themselves as well. They have to train their mind to a point of being balanced. I think there's this concept, at least that I've seen around online, of, oh, I've got mental illness, and that means that I am a healer or a shaman. But if you ever meet any traditional shaman in any culture, that at least the ones that I've encountered, they're all very stable, very down to earth people, and very logical.
Yeah, it really is. I feel like this could be a whole episode in itself, this conversation. And again, maybe we'd come back and go deeper into this. But there's one thing that I think would be so helpful to be understood when people are, to be honest, this probably goes out more broadly to other spiritual practices too, is what we're talking about here. I mean, what you just said there, Eddie, about how are you going to know the difference between projections of the mind and things that are being said by the spirits? It's like, well, how would you if you don't understand your own mind? But it's just not even knowing that as a distinction, I think gets us into all kinds of hot water. So yeah, I do feel like this is, again, such an important thing. I just wanted to make sure we'd covered before we closed. Any final words that you'd like to add, Eddie, before we close?
I think I'd just like to reiterate that I really hope I haven't come across as someone who's attacking core shamanism or neo-shamanism or other Western practices. I am simply just trying to share my personal experience, and that, you know, if anyone is going through a similar experience or they've had similar questions, you know, offer them an alternative route or path into practicing shamanism. You know, I do apologize if I offended anyone, but I do think these things are very important to talk about. I think there are lots of people who have had similar experiences to mine, and just that my door is always open if people want to message or talk or give any feedback.
Thank you. And I really appreciate your humility and sensitivity throughout this. Isaac, anything you would like to say before we close?
I would like to obviously echo what Eddie said with that. Hopefully I have not caused offense to anyone. Obviously, I'm only speaking from the things that I've experienced, and also talking to others that have experienced these things as well. I have no personal training in core or neo-shamanism, so my only encountering it has come from people that have practiced it themselves.
And anything else? You can't just echo Eddie's thoughts. I'd like to hear something else too.
I think actually, if I may just jump in and just say something we haven't covered, I don't think is, although Isaac and I have a traditional Mongolian teacher, we are not obviously traditional Mongolian shamans, and we never will be. I know Isaac mentioned that because these traditional practices, they have a deep understanding of universal law, they can be applied anywhere. That is our teachers and our hope that we are become practitioners for our own countries and our own communities. And these incredible methods that our teacher and others have been so generous to share with the West can be applied here and grounded here. So if anyone's listening to this and thinking, oh, well, I'm really interested in shamanism, but my ancestry is nothing to do with Mongolia, we totally understand that. And we hope that it doesn't come across like we are, that this isn't something that can be applied anywhere and can be incredibly grounded in this land, because Isaac has been practicing for very successfully for 6 years, and I've started recently to practice as well, and these methods work wherever you are and they can be applied.
Yeah, great addition. Thank you, Eddie. Isaac.
Yeah. I would say they truly can be practiced anywhere. I've been helping people for 6 years. I've been learning for 10, and the natural world, the spirits, they respond exactly the same wherever you are. And we're not Mongolian shamans because we never will be, because we're not Mongolian. We're English shamans, but we just have been trained within this lineage, and we've been trained how to help our own communities and the people around us. But there are now teachers available in the West for Western practitioners if they want to learn about this and learn about these universal law, learn about the sciences, such as Mother Tree Shamanism and Bola. These are two of the, I believe they are the only two that are teaching publicly.
Wonderful. Well, coming to that, where can listeners find out more about you both and your work and Mother Tree Shamanism?
I'll let you go first, Isaac.
Okay. So you can find Mother Tree Shamanism on Facebook or Instagram. And there's also an email that you can email at mothertreeshamanism@gmail.com.
Wonderful. And Eddie, I think you've got your own website. Would you like to share that as well?
Yep. My website is streetspirituality.com. And if you want to have a chat on Instagram, it's at Eddy Elsey.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, both of you. In the time that we have, I feel like we've gone to some really interesting places, and thank you so much for sharing your stories as well. Really appreciate you both.
Thanks so much for having us. Hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Yes, I would love to. Thank you. I very much hope you enjoyed watching that. And if you did and you're not already subscribed, then do hit that bell thingy and subscribe to automatically get each fresh new episode as it's released each week. If you'd like to find out more about the work we do at Be Mythical to guide and support old souls in this new world to live their own unique myth, do hop along to bemythical.com and you'll find out all the ways you can join us and go deeper with us on your own mythical journey. Lots of love for now. Mwah. See you again next week.